So if you go to the next slide, please. Uh, this talk was motivated by a question that Mike has asked several times about whether solutions to problems in any space can be viewed as attractors that kind of pull problem-solving processes toward them. And uh, so we can ask for any physical process that maps some state to some final state, how can the future state attract the past state? And we got one answer to that last week from Rob Phillips in his talk, uh, and it's ascertainment bias. If you only look at successful paths that actually reach the final state, then it will look to you like the final state is attracting the paths because you don't see paths that may diverge in other directions. So that's what happens if you condition on success, like looking at extant organisms as opposed to all possible evolutionary pathways. So next, please. Uh, what I want to do today is look at this from the point of view of fundamental physics and look briefly at retrocausality in physics in general, have a brief look at psychology, then start to look carefully at measurement, and particularly the measurement of time and how our measured time differs from the background time of the theory, whether we're in classical theory or quantum theory. I'll talk about computation in these two kinds of time. We'll expand it to space-time and see how space-time works as a shared memory for multiple observers. I'll say a few things about how to make this precise, and then talk a little bit about applying it to biology and how it changes our thinking about processes in general. So next, please. You're probably all familiar with this kind of picture from special relativity, which distinguishes three different kinds of paths. Paths can go from the past to the future, and those are called time-like. There can be paths that go horizontally in space-time, i.e. paths that don't require any time. Those are space-like paths, or would appear to be moving faster than light. And then there are light-like paths, which are the paths that only photons follow, or anything else that's moving exactly at the speed of light. And if we turn this picture into a picture of causality on the next slide, then it distinguishes possible kinds of actions on some state. So if we think of the state located right in the middle where these two light-like paths that define the light cone cross, then we can distinguish causal influences, which are information essentially flowing from the past, the causal past, the time-like past toward the event. And those are the kinds of influences that classical physics studies. And since the life sciences are conceptually still based on classical physics, those are the kinds of influences that we study in the life sciences. Now, you could look at the mirror image of that. If you had information flowing at less than the speed of light from the future, those would be retrocausal influences. And if you have information flowing effectively faster than light or even in no time at all, those would be non-local, non-causal influences. And the standard example of that is entanglement. If you have entities that are entangled, even though they're space-like separated, then actions on one, for example, measurements of a half of an entangled state, will immediately affect what's going on at the other part of that entangled state, even though it may be located very far away. And that effect is not causal. So we can distinguish these different kinds of influences. And what I want to talk about today mostly is retrocausal influences. So on the next slide
Well,
is just a,
can I interrupt you, Chris, just for a
yeah,
second?
sure.
So I sorry, I know you're going to talk about retrocausal, but if the the non-local ones, the entanglement one, if I act on one state A and simultaneously something happens at state B, is that not what makes that not causal? Because in my naive brain, I would think I did one thing and therefore another thing happened, therefore
Uh,
causal.
you can think of it in, well, it depends on how you use the word causal.
Ah, okay.
And,
That might be a
uh,
naive use of the
yeah,
word causal.
causal in physics just means compliant with special relativity. So
Okay. So this is not the same causality we talk about
it's,
typically in
yeah,
other.
it's,
Okay.
it's information has to move in space or time by some physical carrier.
Got it. Then
And
that makes
the,
sense. Okay.
yeah, so
Cool.
the fastest physical carrier is a photon.
Okay.
Okay.
All right. I jive with that. Thanks.
So even in classical physics, we have this formal time symmetry. So, for example, if you look at a billiard ball collision backwards in time, it looks just like a billiard ball collision. It doesn't look weird. And if you solve the classical wave equation, for example, the wave equation for light, then you get two solutions, one that moves forward in time and one that moves backwards in time. And the backwards in time one is called the advanced solution. Um, the forwards in time is called retarded, and typically the advanced solution is just dismissed as not physical, as just an artifact of the mathematics. So people focus on the retarded solutions and they don't really talk about um, waves moving backwards in time, even though the math tells you that they're there. Uh, our sense of time in classical physics is based on entropy. Uh, Uncertainty increases toward the future. That's the second law. Eddington emphasized this interpretation of time, so it goes back to the early 20th century. And what has to be asked about that is whose uncertainty is it? Is it everybody's uncertainty or is it just the uncertainty of some observer? Similarly, memory fixes an observed past for an observer, and if the memory is shared by lots of observers, it looks more certain. But then we have to ask who measures this redundancy. And uh, the other move that's typical in classical physics is to say that away from the Big Bang is the future. But of course, we inferred the Big Bang by measuring time. So that argument is actually circular. So go on to the next slide. And I have to go sort of fast here. Quantum theory, in a sense, makes this all easier because it assumes time symmetry is an axiom. It's the axiom of unitarity that applies to all isolated systems, evolve in a way that's time symmetric. And the time they're evolving in, because they're isolated, isn't observable. And that's by definition. So there's a background time in quantum theory that's also there in classical theory, but it's hidden. That quantum theory makes it explicit that that's not observable. And if nothing is added to quantum theory to produce some sort of observer independent, non unitary uh, dynamics, which has never been observed, then all classical information is observer relative. It's not objective. And I just a reminder here that quantum just means that information comes in discrete units. It doesn't have anything to do with size or scale or space. So go on to the next, please. And here's an example of time symmetry in quantum theory. Many of you are probably familiar with antiparticles as particles moving backwards in time. So specifically an electron moving backwards in time, for example, is a positron, an electron-like entity with positive charge. and opposite spin. You have to flip charge and spin when you flip time in quantum theory. So observing an electron coming from the past is just the same as observing a positron coming from the past is the same as seeing an electron coming from the future. So of these two diagrams, the one on the left is just positron electron annihilation. You see that in beta plus decay all the time. That's why beta plus decay looks like gamma ray emission. But it's exactly the same thing as an electron bouncing off of a photon coming from the future and turning around and going back into the past, whereas the photon turns around and goes back into the future.
So, sorry, just a quick question, and maybe you're getting to this, but does this mean that if you have a cognitive system that's using these kinds of dynamics, then you can't quite tell if something is a memory or a prediction? Is that what this means?
Well, that's a very good question because it asks the question who can't tell,
Yeah.
and the person experiencing the memory could experience it as a memory and not know that it's a memory. And such people sort of clinically have a problem with source attribution. But yes, I mean, in principle, that's what we're talking about. So this is a physics example. On the next slide is another physics example. It turns out to actually be useful in quantum computation to think about processes going both directions in time. Luigi Castagnoli has written several papers. Probably the most complete is in Foundations of Physics, pointing out that known cases of quantum advantage in computing can actually be explained by assuming that the computational process has half of the answer up front, that half of the answer is built into the problem setup. And this effect can be produced just by noting that the quantum computation has to be effectively isolated to work. And so it's effectively unitary, and so it's effectively time symmetric. So the quantum computation is actually moving from the answer toward the problem statement at the same time that it's moving from the problem statement toward the answer. And we observe that as a speed up. His argument, his papers are, of course, much more complicated than that because he does it all taking all of the formalism into account in a reasonable model of quantum computing. But this sort of thing is not regarded as crazy in physics. It's kind of regarded as just what quantum theory tells you is the way things work. On the other hand, in the life sciences, this does tend to be regarded as crazy. The next slide shows you a picture from a review article on psychology experiments done by Julia Mossbridge and colleagues. And most psychologists really don't want to believe that anything like that happens. But these sorts of experiments have been done over and over again and with what at least seem to be very good controls. And what they indicate is that physiological processes tend to be different before an event, depending on whether the event is expected by the subject or not. And these two plots show data for males and females. And I think the effect's actually larger in males, if I remember correctly. So there are anomalous studies, so-called, like this one, that suggest that one can see what look like retrocausal influences in humans of the sort Mike is basically describing. I mean, it's not clear how people experience this. They don't claim to know what they're going to see. But they do claim to have a feeling about it.
So I wonder if that's a little bit like the mind, the blind sight phenomenon. You know, the people who can see, but they don't know they can see. So if you ask them, right, Dana talked about this a lot, that you say, hey, throw the ball to me, and they say, well, I have no idea where you are, and they say, well, come on, just try, and they'll hit it every time. They know exactly where everything is. They just don't have conscious access to the fact that it's happening. I wonder if this is like that. I wonder if there is some of this capability, and we just, maybe because of social conditioning, who knows why, but we're just not able to comprehend it that way.
Yeah, I don't know. In the blind sight case, some of the mechanism is known. They have a preserved dorsal visual pathway, but not a preserved ventral visual pathway. So their ability to see motion is preserved. Or at least that's the explanation for it that I've seen. I think that's still current. But it's not clear what's going on in these cases in terms of neuroscience. And probably it's impossible to get funding to find out. um, so
Can I also ask a quick question?
Sure.
Or two. The first would be, would there be an analog to positrons here, like the inverted information going the other way? What would be the symmetry transformations applied to the forward way to pinpoint down is it I forgot the name of the process, the backward process, so to say.
I don't think anyone has any idea
Mhm.
what the information carrier is here.
Yeah. But it might help to articulate at some point to get gradually to the stage that it gets accepted probably by people. Not sure.
Yeah, I mean, something about mechanism will have to be figured out.
I mean,
Yeah.
is it naive to guess it in a psychology example? I'm not sure what the stimulus is, but if I have a gut feeling or a hunch that it's going to be one thing instead of the other, maybe that hunch puts me in a certain dynamical regime rather than another, whatever that may be, and that's what this future stuff is. Like, if I have to explain why my physiology is different, if it's, let's say correct or incorrect or A versus B, maybe it's like a weird prediction stuff that kicks you into one thing. Like if someone tasked me to try to measure this, that's probably where I would start. Does that make any sense, or am I totally off
I'd
base?
suggest here reading the papers by just look up Julia Mossbridge on Google Scholar and read some of their speculations about what's going on and also how they do the experiment.
There's something else that's always bothered me about and there's a ton of data of this type, that if this, why has evolution not optimized the hell out of this? In other words, right, if it is symmetric and you do have a peek into the future, you would think that the advantage of animals competing with each other over this kind of stuff would be massive, and that whatever the mechanism is to make use of this, evolution should have been cranking on this stuff. Like we should, it should all be much more obvious than it is. Any thoughts on that?
Well, I think my thought would be it goes back to your question about how we assign things as being memories. So let me go on and talk a bit about measurement because I want to get through some of this. So I'll just remind you that 3,000 years ago, Heraclitus told us that we don't measure time. And 300 years ago, Hume told us that we don't recognize any processes as causal. But to try to deal with this, it turns out that some tools from physics are actually useful, and specifically from the quantum theory of space-time. And so I'm going to go through this and then talk a bit about how it changes our thinking. Let's look at measurement of time. Classically, if we have two observers, Alice and Bob, and they're interacting with a clock and they're conveniently equidistant from it, then the clock ticks, and sometime later, the signal arrives at the speed of light, let's say, to Alice and Bob. And it takes them some time to figure out that they've detected this click. But after some period of time, they send messages to each other saying, I heard a click. And those messages take some time to arrive. And when they do, Alice and Bob know that they're sharing a clock, that they've each observed a tick from this clock. And they even now know that they're equidistant from it. So it's a process, and this process takes time. And we can ask exactly what has to happen for the process we've drawn here to works. And that's on the next slide. Alice and Bob have to be able to detect and recognize signals from this clock specifically. They have to be able to update their memories and act on their environments. So they have to have memory specifically to be able to do the processing from hearing a click to saying, I heard a click. They have to be able to detect and recognize signals from each other, and they have to speak the same language. So to just talk about sharing a clock in classical physics, we have to assume a whole lot of stuff, in particular, a whole lot of computational resources and time. We have to assume that there's time for all of this process to take place in. And this is what we call background time. It's a time the theory has to assume that's not measurable by anybody. It's the time that it takes for the clock to tick in and for the processing that the observers do to take place in. It's not a time that they can see by looking at a clock. So let's now put this in terms of quantum theory on the next slide. And this is a kind of picture that we've seen before that depicts a local operation classical communication protocol. So they're interacting with the clock, which is just some quantum system. On some quantum channel, they're making a local measurement at their interface. So each of them is looking at their interface with their environment. And at that interface, a photon arrives. And they use some internal processing inside their systems, which I call Q1 and Q2. And then they send signals to each other on a classical channel saying, I just got a tick. So we have to ask how they know they share these channels. So move on. Let's just look inside Alice. There's a lot of stuff going on. So I've drawn Alice's interface with her environment. And again, her interface with her environment just lights up with an event at some time. The photon arrives at her eyeball, for example. And so she gets a measurement outcome transmitted from her eyeball saying something happened. And she may also get some information that arrives at a different part of her interface, say her tympanic membrane, when she hears Bob say, I got a tick. And that information flows inward from that part of her interface to some sort of processing in her brain. And that processing takes memory and time and energy and all that. And it produces actions, again, at her interface, at various of her interfaces, including her saying to Bob, I just heard a tick. So this is a typical sort of active inference picture where there's sensation, there's action, and there's a bunch of model-based expectation-based processing in between. So we can also draw this in a different way on the next slide. You've all also seen this sort of picture in various of my talks or papers. And here we've just drawn it in a way that emphasizes that free energy has to flow from the environment through Alice. And some of that free energy is used to drive her internal processing. And to the extent that her internal processing involves writing irreversibly on her environment, so for example, writing memories that she can go back and look at later, like taking notes in a lab notebook. Her processing requires time. So she has to have an internal clock that distinguishes her current state from her past state in order to know that something happened in the past and say something about it in the future. So all observers that are capable of learning or memory have to implement these kinds of internal clocks. And they're basically entropic devices. They suck free energy out of the environment and they dump waste heat into the environment. So they change the entropy of the environment. And notice that this requires a causality assumption. We have to assume that energy flows in, that it does something, and then it flows out. And that causality assumption is built in as soon as we say irreversible action on the environment, or the conversion of free energy into waste heat. So we're already starting to build causality into this theory. So now, if you look at the next slide, it just emphasizes that the physics at this boundary between Alice and her environment is completely symmetrical. So we can think of the environment as doing the same thing. So Alice's clock ticks when a bit arrives from the environment. The environment's clock ticks when a bit arrives from Alice. The environment's just Alice's mirror image here, from the point of view of that previous picture. So Alice's clock and the environment's clock count the same number of ticks, but in opposite direction. The environment counts when it gets a bit. The environment's clock ticks when Alice sends it a bit. Alice's clock ticks when the environment sends Alice a bit. So the bits are flowing in opposite directions when the clocks are ticking. So if we think of this in terms of entropy, Alice's clock ticks when she gets free energy from the environment, and so the environment's entropy increases relative to her. The environment's clock ticks when it gets free energy from Alice, and Alice's entropy increases relative to it. So the entropic time for these two systems is oppositely oriented. Alice's entropic future is the environment, and the environment's entropic future is Alice. So here we see time symmetry defined at the boundary, and it's not symmetric background time, it's symmetric user-specific entropic time. And if we think of Alice and Bob together now, interacting with a shared environment, then as in this picture, this one, Alice and Bob will be seeing similar entropic time if they're symmetrical systems that run at the same rate and use the same amount of free energy, et cetera, which we can assume. They'll both see the environment as their entropic future, and the environment will see the two of them as its entropic future.
Can I
So
ask
we
a
have,
quick question?
yeah.
So in the way that you just described it, there's the environment and then like Alice and Bob. So there's one environment and two observers.
Right.
Does it change the math or does it matter? What if it's, if I'm Alice, the environment includes Bob, and if I'm is it that Bob is part of my environment, or is the environment like really a separate third thing? If that makes sense.
We can think of the situation either way,
Okay.
and they can't be distinguishable for Alice.
Okay.
And they also can't be distinguishable for Bob.
Okay. I think if I
Yes.
wrestle with that, I can parse that. Okay, cool. Thank you. I was just checking.
So now with this thinking about entropic time, we can now answer these questions about how Alice and Bob know about the channels that they share. And specifically, if they share a channel to a clock that they're both using that's located in the environment, and whether they're actually communicating to each other about their shared inputs from this clock. So on the next slide, there, the answer to those questions is they don't. In other words, Heraclitus was right. Alice and Bob just see bits coming from E, and E just sees bits coming from Alice and Bob. So to make this whole situation work, we have to make a bunch of assumptions. We have to assume that Alice has something that's a Bob identifier. We have to assume Bob has an Alice identifier. We have to assume they speak the same language. We have to assume they share this channel. And if we're talking from any of their points of view, then they have to know that they are assuming this. So I have to assume that I have an identifier from my computer, that I can distinguish it from the rest of the environment, because I can't deduce that from my observations. I can't deduce that just from the bits that I see coming from my environment. So that tells us that we actually have to assume classical communication. We can't do experiments that confirm that we're receiving classical bits. Our local actions on our environments are all the same from the point of view of our internal processes. We can't distinguish some of them as being classical and some of them as being quantum measurements. And this point was made years ago by Frank Tipler in a paper that hasn't received, I think, nearly the attention that it should have received. So go on now, and we'll start to build these assumptions into our theory of what's going on. The basic message is that this applies to every protocol where we share any channels at all. We have to make these a priori causality assumptions to talk about communication, and hence to talk about sharing access to other objects in the environment, which of course we do all the time. But this means that Hume was right, that we don't deduce causation. We actually assume causation when we're dealing with our environment and dealing with other observers. So keep going again, please. So now let's apply this to quantum computing or any other sort of experimental physics process, experimental process in general. So if I'm Alice and I prepare some state, and then I let it evolve through time in some effectively isolated way, and later on, so my future self makes a measurement and gets an output. Later on for me means I'm using some clock to separate my whatever I do to prepare the state from whatever I do to measure the state. And it's probably an external clock because I need an external clock to distinguish counting bits that indicate the passage of some agreed to time in the laboratory from counting bits that correspond to something else in my environment that I haven't identified. My internal clock is just counting experiences. But if I use an external clock, then I can say I'm counting experiences of a particular kind. And so key to this is the classical communication from my current self when I prepare the state to my future self when I measure the state. And that classical communication is my memory of the preparation conditions. So I remembered what I did back then in order to know what to measure now. And we just saw that we can't deduce that a communication is classical. We have to assume it. So we similarly have to assume that what we remember is actually what we did. And of course, that's a good pragmatic assumption. Without it, we can't do anything. So keep going here. We'll now make these more explicit by writing this whole process as a lock protocol and thinking of future Alice as Bob. Alice is sending a message into the future with her preparation conditions. Bob's getting it from his past. And they're connected by some process, which is a quantum computation or an experiment of some kind. And if they're sharing a clock, they're connected by another process, which is this shared clock. And so we can think of the clock as just another arm of this lock protocol, another channel where there's getting information that's time symmetric, that the clock is sending to both of them. But they're seeing it in this laboratory time that they've agreed to use. So keep going again, please. So in this representation, we can ask, what is E? What is the environment, which now is expanded in time? Well, that environment is space-time. It's the space in the laboratory where the process is happening, and it's the time during which the process has happened. So we can think of that E as a shared memory that Alice is writing on here and Bob is reading from. But since it's a quantum shared memory, we can think of the time as flowing backwards, even though the observers here have agreed by a convention that they're going to use an external clock to assign a flow of time to this environment. And interestingly, the idea of space-time as basically a shared memory is one of the major results to come out of quantum gravity work in this kind of model system called ADS-CFT, which is the equivalence between a particular representation of space-time and a particular representation of quantum field theory. So people have worked on this kind of picture now for a long time, and there are mountains of results to be taken into account trying to use this stuff. So on the next slide, kind of a summary of where we've gotten to. Basically, to talk about anything happening, we have to assume this background time. Anything that's a quantum channel is time symmetric by definition. And we have these energetically expensive processes that we treat as causal and as counting time that we can observe. And classicality requires this. So Kant was right too, as well as Hume and Heraclitus. So on the next slide, I can talk a little bit about making this precise. Proving that causality can't be emergent from observation is basically what we've just gone through in a very informal way. But actually understanding it in terms of the processes of manipulating channels requires a lot of work. And some colleagues and I are approaching this by trying to compare the theory of computation to the theory of scattering and show that we can represent them both in lock and that they both have all the properties we've just been discussing. And there's a nice result of doing that, which is that about 10 years ago, Arkani Hamed and his group introduced a way of representing the amplitudes of quantum processes by these geometric objects they called amplituhedra. And if computation is really a general language for talking about physical processes, then these amplituhedra exist for computations, which would be really nice because they can be computed using generic methods that aren't problem specific. And so in principle, at least, we have a representation of computation that's problem non-specific, that's just based on symmetries that are involved in the preservation of information, symmetries that can be captured by unitary processes. So that's a thing we're working on. And the nice thing about these objects, and this gets Mike to, I think, some of your points about kind of things that Plato gives us for free, or things that math gives us for free. I mean, these objects, in a sense, would be the perfect Platonic objects because they capture information about processes that's universal and that's independent of how those processes are implemented. And they capture it just with symmetries. So I think there's something to be gotten out of some of these, out of a lot of work that other people have done about these sorts of representations of processes in terms of underlying symmetries. And they're not space-time symmetries, which is the cool thing. So where does this leave us in biology? I think where it leaves us is what I've illustrated here, that it's not just a matter of some solution attracting a starting point. And I think it's not even just a matter of it's not a matter of a typical causal process. It's not even a matter of a retrocausal process. It's that the whole system that we're thinking about, which involves us and involves our clocks and involves our environment, is evolving in this symmetric way. So we're kind of causal observers who are causal because of our ability to remember things, which allows us to plan things. But we're embedded in this symmetric dynamics. And we're not good at thinking about this. And if we try to think about it this way, then it forces us to change the way we think, I think. And I've summarized some of those changes on the next slide. I think it means that we're used to asking about what causes particular events. And I think it's even more important to ask about the evolution of the context around an event, and what caused the context to evolve in the way that it did. And when we think about things like target morphologies, we are starting to ask that question about how the context in which the system is developing or undergoing morphogenesis or evolving is changing along with the system. Which really means that we can't talk about generic boundary conditions. The boundary conditions are always things that are changing. And the evolution of the boundary conditions is a large part of the evolution of the solution. And this is a point that Rosen, I think, tried to make over and over again in his very convoluted language. But I think we see it very clearly when we think about it from this symmetric physics kind of way. It also tells us that anytime we're assuming randomness, we're assuming something that's observer relative. There isn't this objective randomness that we can just throw in the soup and make things better. We have to ask, who is it that's not aware of what's going on? And the who it is us. And if you look all the way back to Boltzmann, a lot of our thinking about randomness is very influenced by Boltzmann. But Boltzmann defined entropy in terms of the number of states of a system that can't be distinguished. So implicit in that is someone who can't distinguish them. And there may be other observers who can distinguish them, and they see the system as having a different entropy. So entropy itself is observer relative, which is, of course, was the point of that whole discussion of entropic time. That we are making a mistake anytime we think about entropy as something other than observer relative. And the penultimate point there is that the informational symmetries that guide these processes in space-time, for example, the kinds of symmetries that are captured by these kinds of geometric representations of processes, aren't themselves definable in space-time. They're only definable in these much larger spaces that aren't, in a sense, spatial or temporal at all, even though they have spatial and temporal boundary conditions when you develop them for scattering experiments. And finally, we're all familiar from a computing point of view with the idea that questions about whether processes are halt or questions about what processes compute, what functions they implement, are not decidable. But it's hard to map that from the theory of computing into everyday life. But these questions really are undecidable. And when we're thinking about experiments or just day-to-day goings on, I think it's important to remember that they're undecidable. So that's it. Thanks a lot. Sorry for going fast. Sorry for not knowing how to use the current version of Zoom. And I wanted to thank Jim and Antonino and Emanuele, who are working on the physics side of all of these questions. And I'll take any other questions that we have time for.
Super interesting. So many things. Just maybe a dumb question. The halting problem. If we put it together with the polycomputing idea, does that mean that two observers can disagree on whether the thing is halted? In other words, if they're interpreting the same physical machine as delivering the answer to some question, I could imagine one observer saying, "Yep, it's done. I got my answer," and the other one saying, "What do you mean? It's still going. I can, you know, from my perspective, it looks like stuff is still happening. I haven't got my answer yet." Is that too much, or could that be a?
No, I think that's right. What we two observers can disagree about, yeah, even how long they want to look at a process.
Yeah.
And if you run some program on your computer, then the program can terminate if that's not something you're interested in. The process that you're interested in is still happening. But from a sort of physical point of view, it's just your computer is doing some behavior, right? The distinction between the processes is semantic. It's imposed by the two observers. So I think that's exactly right.
Is there, I was just thinking about maybe kind of two differences in worldview, I guess, about like whether the world is deterministic or non-deterministic. And I guess the opposite of what you're posing here is that we're all the environment, that there is no kind of individual observer and there's no, you know, shared flocks and, you know, I don't know. I was just thinking about what, yeah, what this kind of means for, I mean, I don't want to bring it to free will, but kind of free will. I don't know, and determinism in the universe.
Yeah, certainly in classical physics, when the word determinism is used, it always means causal determinism. And here I would encourage you to look at something called the Conway-Kochen theorem, which is a little bit technical, but the bottom line of that theorem is that basically there is no causal determinism. that's actually inconsistent with the combining quantum theory with special relativity. So everything we've talked about here. And there are multiple ways to see that. Time symmetry is one of them. And as Wes was bringing up toward the beginning of the talk, when we use the word cause informally, things like entanglement look like possible causal influences that are non-local and faster than light, all of that. And people actually do use that kind of vocabulary fairly often.